Hello, everybody. Before I get to the story, I'd like to provide a brief introduction. Also, if you need a recap of the key events from The Borrower's Avenged, which precede this story, please see the summary in the description. Last year, I reread the Borrower's series with my wife. While generally charming and enjoyable, we felt that the ending of the final book was unsatisfyingly abrupt, and we wanted a conclusion to a couple of the threads that were left hanging. In particular, Arrietty's outburst at Spiller, in which she accused him of not fulfilling his promise to her, to inform her human friend Miss Menzies of her family's safety. The unresolved relationship between Arrietty and Spiller, and its ending on a sour note, led me to search online for a more fulfilling ending to the series. Fortunately, I was able to find it in this fanfiction by C.I. Racon, which neatly ties up that plot point, and even does so with a writing style reminiscent of Mary Norton's original books. And so, please allow me to introduce to you what I consider to be Book 5.5 of the Borrower series, The Borrower's Ever After, by C.I. Racon. As Miss Menzies would later recall when she would sit at tea with a young girl who came to be a companion in her old age, circumstantial proof of the existence of borrowers was everywhere to be found. One should only look and believe. With her trembling hands around the lovely painted porcelain, she would recollect her brief encounter with those marvelous little people. She would tell the girl, Mary she was called, all about Arrietty Clock, the brave girl who opened her eyes to a whole new world. The miniature village of Mr. Pott had been restored to its former glory, after the midnight rampage. Up to this day, though never proven, she always believed it to have been those dreadful Platters. Thank goodness they up and moved to Australia. The likes of those, Miss Menzies would say, with the sternest expression as she could manage, are what causes borrowers to be afraid of human beings such as us. The teacup clattered a bit when she set it down. Drops of milky brown liquid splashed on the platter. Leave it, dear, she said, as Mary made to clear the little tea table when they rose. We'll clean it later. Give them little folks a chance to take some of it. Mary nodded obediently. She, at 14, did not know quite so well if she believed the old lady. Nonetheless, did she love the stories, especially the one about the last time Miss Menzies saw an actual borrower. She knew the story by heart, for the old miss had told it many times, her memory going how it went, as the way goes for old people. Mary, Miss Menzies would begin, he was practically invisible. Spiller, ma'am? Yes, dear, that wild boy Spiller. Practically a voice out of nowhere. But there he was one late afternoon. We were working late, Mr. Pott and me, finishing the last of the clearing-ups from Easter. You can't leave too many painted eggs lying around. The smell becomes awful after a while. But I left a few, for them, you know, to borrow. They could eat days from one good boiled egg. But there it was, as I said goodbye to Mr. Pott, rest his soul, and such a gentle soul it was. Always so friendly and calmly listening to me prattling along. But I drift now. As I was telling, there it was, a small light. I knew exactly where it was. It used to be their house, you know. The one we had furnished and that had been robbed empty by those awful Platters. Or at least, that was what we thought up to that point. Those awful people. Good riddance, I say. At first I thought my eyes were playing a trick with me. We'd removed the electric light we had made earlier. Some of the wiring had been damaged, and we didn't want a fire to blaze. And since they weren't coming home, so we believed, we took the wiring out. And yet, there it was, a flicker of light, so I rushed over and crouched down. At first I saw nothing. The light was gone, and so was the sun, almost. Everything was shadows by then. It was at that moment, as I made to get up and leave, that I heard it. By this time, Mary, every time, was sitting on the edge of whatever chair she was sitting on. Her eyes large, her mouth almost open, and the knuckles of her hands white with strain. What was it, ma'am? What did he say? Because, after the first time she heard the story, she had known it had been Spiller. Invisible, wild Spiller, who had lit a candle stump in order to draw the attention of the dreaded human being. Something that went against every instinct, but a promise once made was sacred to one such as Spiller. And so he overcame his fear, trusting the girl who caused him to make it in the first place. It was only a few words, but they warmed my heart and soul, and if he had been a bit bigger, I was sure I would have hugged him out of gratitude. Now, mind you, I saw a shadow, and had I not been sobbing, I reckon I would have seen a bit better. But as it was, I saw a shadow, and I heard his voice. They are all right. That's what he said. They are all right. She wanted me to tell you. At this point in the story, Miss Menzies would always pull out a handkerchief from her sleeve to dab at her eyes, and Mary would feel the gravity of the moment deep in her heart. I knew immediately of what he spoke, so I cried my heart out. There were a million things I wanted to ask, but the shadow vanished and I never saw him again. But, oh, child, just to know they were all right. And I knew it then. That was a gift from heaven itself. Miss Menzies, after telling that particular story, would always be quiet for some time, and Mary had learned not to ask anything until supper, or luncheon, or whatever kind of regular activity would rouse the old lady from her memories. Events after the church ordeal, as Arrietty had begun to call it, calmed down quite a bit. After her rather embarrassing outburst towards Spiller, in Peagreen's place, she slowly walked back home. The small egg wrapped up in her dress, a shrewd reminder of how ungrateful she had been towards the one who always provided them with bits and bobs, who even saved their lives and provided them with homes. She should never have said something to poor Spiller, accusing him of not following through on a promise. Peagreen was absolutely right. Spiller never broke a promise, and she was horrible for implying he would. In particular for a person such as Spiller, one who was hardly seen by a borrower, let alone a human being. How could she have been so cruel? Her remorse became worse by the hour, especially when a whole day passed by without so much as a glimpse of the stealthy borrower. She always missed him when he was away, but for the first time she became scared he would not return. It would be her fault, and she cried bitter tears in bed that night. The next few days she would climb up the box hedge and sit for hours, looking, longing to see the familiar bow and quiver. Easter came and went. Lots and lots of people visited the church and its magnificent flower display. Borrowing was a real treat in those days because so many people were bound to drop things. She found a practically new leather glove for her father to make shoes out of, wrapped candy of which they hacked off bits to suck on. Timmus discovered a comb he dragged all the way to his house, and it soon served as a coat rack. And of course, there were the eggs, brightly painted with little flowers and birds. Others were decorated with stripes and dots, and a few were completely blue, red, and yellow. The children of the village came to look that first Easter day, and every borrower was safely hidden indoors as the children were very diligent in their search. One time the family even saw a round face with golden curls, eyes alight, and tongue peeping out of the corner of his mouth, very close to the grating. Arrietty had seen the hand that had put the blue egg near the mossy brick a few hours earlier, and her father had told her to wait with the borrowing. He had learned about Easter from Uncle Hendreary, and knew they were not to touch the eggs until after, when the grown-ups would have done the second search for leftover eggs. The blue egg would have been an easy borrowing, and she was sorry to see it go, flying up in the grubby hand of the squealing boy. Instead, later that evening, as the people went home for dinner and the birds ventured out to sing their evening songs, Arrietty found one, painted lovingly with white daisies in a green field. They were all sad to break it, and carefully she salvaged a few shell shards. Pott polished the sharp edges so the pieces became round as plates. With a little resin, Arrietty fastened the plate-like circles with their artistic flowers against her bedroom wall, right above the head of her bed. Now, every night before going to sleep, she would see the lovely paintings. Little did she know that her beloved treasures were made by her old friend, Miss Menzies. How much more cherished would they have been had she known? Spiller did not return the second Easter day, when, again, loads of visitors trampled the path up to the church. Nor did they see him the day after that, when it was only Mrs. Witless to water the flowers, and go about business as usual. At dinner, she voiced her concern, but Homily was too busy mulling over a new recipe Aunt Lupy had given her, and Pod told his daughter not to worry. It wasn't the first time Spiller disappeared for days, nor, so he said airily, would it be the last. Arrietty daren't tell them about what she'd said. The horrible words she had uttered, that came back to haunt her each time a noise announced something other than the arrival of a clearly missed friend. Oh, how she longed to apologize, to take back the words spoken in grief. How she rehearsed and repeated lines to say to him if he ever did return. She became terribly quiet, to a point where even Timmus asked if something was the matter. She could not tell him. Peagreen, the only one who knew what had befallen between the two, remained silent on the matter, for which she was grateful. Yet, on the eve of the 5th day, as she sat on the edge of her bed, with a tear-stained face, she confided at last in her mother. Homily, worried about her normally so enthusiastic daughter, had taken it upon herself to find out what bothered the girl. So that evening she prepared a nice cup of tea from a few scraps of dried chamomile from the larder. She gave Pott a look and stepped through the door to Arrietty's little room. "Summer poems on Irish green hills," it said on the front, with bright blue curls in all corners. It swung without a sound open and shut and allowed the bearer of the somewhat large miniature teacup to enter without having to use her hands. When Arrietty failed to look up, Homily sat down on the bed beside her, handed her the cup, and said, There now, dear. What's the matter? You have been out of sorts all these past days. Do tell me what ails you, child." And then and there, Arrietty bowed her head, her falling tears adding a little salt to the tea. She sobbed and explained the whole thing to her mother. Because the room the house was built in was spacious and the walls were merely cardboard and paper, Pott as well heard the whole story. Softly he shook his head and after a while smiled his paternal smile. Yet he didn't say a word, understanding this was told to Homily in confidence. "And now," Arrietty at last sighed, no more tears left to shed, "he won't ever come back, because I was so mean to him." The teacup, still full, was taken out of her hands by her mother, who after setting the thin porcelain utensil on the nightstand took Arrietty in her arms. The child had grown, she had to admit. No longer could she fit her head against her shoulder or sit on her lap as she used to do. Arrietty's curly brown-reddish hair by now reached well over her shoulders. Her hands, a bit coarse from the many outside borrowings, were as long as hers, slim, delicate, but no longer childlike. And when she looked down to their feet, gently rubbing Arrietty's back, she saw the hem of her daughter's dress almost reached her knees. No, her daughter was no longer a little girl. She became a woman, and this was her first real cry over a boy. Homily almost started to cry herself. Quickly she composed herself, as she said a little sternly, Now, stop your weeping, girl. You know as well as we all do that Spiller will not be chased away by some nonsense as a little argument." "But, mother, I was horrid to him." Arrietty moved back and gazed at her hands aghast, as if those had done the offending. "Yes, dear, and I dare say he would have been kind of angry, but not so much as to stay away forever." Homily handed her daughter a handkerchief, made out of a larger specimen they'd found under a cherry tree next to the front entrance of the house. The girl wiped her face and at last took a small sip from the cup with the cooled-down chamomile tea. She had to believe her mother was right. Yes, Spiller had been mad, but he would be back one day, and then she would apologize and all would be well again, wouldn't it? They would go back to their easy meandering. She would talk about her borrowings, and he would listen with those smart eyes, silent as always. Then he would get up, disappear with his bow, and after a while return with some or other slain rodent trailing behind him. She would follow him to his hideout near an outer gas pipe, from which he fabricated a small smoke oven, and she would leave him to do with the mouse, rat, or what not, what it was he did. After some time he would bring them a piece of savory meat or some fur, and she would smile at him. Yes, all would be well. Homily helped her undress, acting as if it were the last time she could, as if she were a child again, and took the empty teacup with her. Arrietty could hear the soft voices of her parents on the other side of the paper wall. She knew of what they spoke, but it did not matter. It had done her good to confide in her mother, but her heart would not be light until she saw Spiller again. After the 7th day, when all Easter decorations were being removed and the flowers, now wilting, disappeared on the compost pile behind the rectory, Arrietty gave up hope. She set to her tasks with a dutiful stride, but everyone could see her heart was not in it. She hardly ever smiled, and Timmus had to do without his favorite stories. Peagreen painted a lovely painting that somewhat resembled Miss Menzies, but even though she liked it immensely and hung it above her desk in her room, it too caused grief. For wasn't it the very same Miss Menzies whose imagined feelings of loss were the cause of the argument that had cost her a dear friendship? How could she have ever let it happen that a human being became more important than a fellow borrower? And not just any borrower, but a favored friend. Arrietty hadn't known her own heart up till now, but she knew. Oh, how she knew it now. Once, what seemed like ages ago, before Miss Menzies even was a future thought, she had, how childish it now seemed, mentioned the idea of marrying Spiller. So immature had she been. Never had she taken into consideration the fact that he might not even want to marry, let alone her, a stupid girl, a house borrower who talked to human beings, something that not once but twice had caused them to lose a comfortable home. No, he would not want to marry someone who cried over the loss of a bean, like one would over a most loved family member. What was it she could provide him with? He took care of all of them. Nothing they had was something he would want. Her heart weighed heavy that night, and not even sleep brought improvement in the morning. Before the sun was wholly up, Arrietty climbed out of bed. Following the talk with her mother, after homily the next day had spoken of making a new dress for her, she had urged her mother to teach her to do it herself. Borrower's clothing had always been made preferably out of dark colors, to be able to blend in with the shadows if need be. Arrietty, as the careless, carefree child she had been up till now, had always wanted frills and ribbons, such as the ladies wore in the pictures of the books she used to read. At that moment, however, thinking only of how Spiller would despise anything so human being-ish, she had made herself a pair of black leggings, cut from a black piece of a man's handkerchief, stitched with precise little stitches. Homily, of course, was shocked once she'd shown it. She'd almost forbidden her daughter to go out like that, were it not for the brown leather skirt that went over the leggings down to her knees. The outfit was very comfortable, and highly useful for climbing. No longer would the rim of her skirt get caught on a thorn. No longer would the ribbon stick between branches. Attached to the skirt with coarse embroidery was the top, sleeveless and also made of brown leather. It had been from one of Spiller's kills, and she had to swallow a few times the first time she had handled the material. Yet it had been cleaned thoroughly, rubbed till it shone, and even though it was still a bit stiff, it soon would be as agile as silk. On top of it all was a jacket that had belonged to Peagreen, until he grew out of it. Homily made him another that he wore on top of his smart white blouse on cold evenings. The first time Arrietty showed Timmus her new outfit, he had laughed until he was rolling on the floor. But as she, for the first time, had been able to come halfway up the bell rope, he'd had to admit that this was way more practical than a dress. Aunt Lupy had been scandalized. "Even in the badger set, even there," had she exclaimed with eyes filled with horror, "we would not be seen like that. Eggletina and I, such boyish clothes, trousers almost. What's the world coming to if girls start wearing trousers?" Arrietty, red in the cheeks, had mumbled something about practicality and had left the church. So here she was, on the early morning of the 9th day following her terrible mistake, as she called it, climbing out of the house through the long route by the kitchen, through the hole next to the hearth. She had asked her father for a pair of boots like the ones he had made for Spiller. No heels and no laces. Pott had stood silently for quite some time, staring at her outfit, her crossed arms and stubborn face, and then he had sat down and made them. They were perfect. Soft like baby bunny hair on the inside, strong and sturdy on the outside. For the first time, no one could hear her approach. To appease her mother, she had kept her hair long and loose, with only a partial ponytail, tied with a dark blue ribbon. Also did she wear a handkerchief in the same color, tied around her neck with the knot on the side. In time, she would ask her father for a belt on which she could hang some satchels or tools. Better yet, she would ask him to teach her how to do it herself. She felt different now, more grown up. One day she would have to be able to take care of herself. Her parents would not be around forever, and she didn't have brothers like Eggletina to do the hard work for her. Her mother had taught her to keep house. She even knew how to cook a little, but she had to know other things as well, borrowing being only one of them. For many hundreds of years, as long as there had been borrowers, it had been so that the men did the borrowing and the women stayed at home. But that had been when dozens of families lived in one great house, and generations were brought up with the values of the grandparents, who were in charge of the community. After these last few years of moving, running, hiding, and living in places like a boot and a stove, Arrietty had learned that those days were over. And she knew her father realized that too, or he would not have allowed her this freedom. Pott already knew, where Homily was still in denial, that survival did not hinge on whether you were a boy or a girl. Arrietty's curiosity, her ability to climb and burrow, had told him that she, unlike her mother, would never be satisfied with sitting indoors, cooped up in the same house all her life. Sometimes, on very rare occasions, he would let his mind wander towards the future. So few borrowers there now were that a future wasn't at all secured. Everybody knew that you needed two to make a family. Two who were not already related in some way, preferably. He foresaw Eggletina and her two brothers coming back here one day, and then there would be 4 young men and only 2 young women. As soon as his mind began to make possible addings-ups, he shut down that trail of thought. Fate would come sooner or later. No need to fret about it before it arrived. Arrietty, unbeknownst to her father's worries, put back the tile and ventured out of doors. She drank a few sips of water from the drip and picked a leaf of mint on which she chewed while deep in thought. She could go up to the pond today. She could make the trip before Mr. or Mrs. Witless were up and about. Perhaps one of Spiller's fishing lines, the ones he had left behind, caught something today. Or she could climb up to her usual spot in the box hedge to oversee the garden. But no, she sighed. There was no use in that. There would be no Spiller to look out for. She decided to make for the pond. Perhaps she could try out Spiller's gas oven, provided there was a fish on the line. The church bell rang 6 by the time she saw the glistening water of the pond. What to the human beings was merely a shallow puddle seemed as vast as an ocean to Arrietty. Standing on the beach of pebbles, right next to where once the boat had been that had carried their dollhouse belongings to the rectory, she was soon lost in thought. So lost that the soft creaking of footsteps did not reach her ears until they were almost upon her. With a startled gasp, she turned, and lo and behold, it was Spiller. Spiller, with his dark hair standing on end, his intelligent eyes roaming her outfit, and his V-shaped grin, telling her he approved. It was Spiller, with his bow in his hand and the arrows sticking out above his left shoulder, safely tucked in his quiver. For a moment, Arrietty thought she was dreaming. It couldn't be, could it? Spiller was never coming back. She'd chased him away with her careless accusation, her horrid words. Tears began to blur her vision, and without another thought, she leapt forward and threw her arms around his neck. "Oh, Spiller," she cried. "I'm so sorry. I should never have said those words. You were right to be angry with me. I'm so sorry. Please do forgive me." There came no reply. In fact, after a little while, Arrietty realized the boy had become frozen. His hands were by his side and his back straight as a rod. He was barely breathing. Slowly she unhooked her arms from around him and pulled back to glance at his face. His face, she knew, was darker than any of theirs. It was because he lived outdoors and had done so all his life. Yet now it seemed the color was even darker, more reddish. And the grin was gone, replaced by a shocked expression that made her own cheeks turn slightly red themselves. In a whisper she said, "I am so glad you came back, Spiller." He blinked once, twice, gave an unusual slow nod, and then he backed away. He seemed shy, but not like he was with strangers or when there were a lot of people around. His gaze he kept on her face the whole time, until his wild eyes disappeared from view, blocked by the large leaves of a dandelion. It wasn't until then that Arrietty felt her heart beating 10 times faster. She heard it, too, the little rickety tick. It went as fast as the trains that used to drive past their house in the miniature village of Mr. Pott. For a few long minutes, she merely stood there and listened, her eyes fixed on the point where the last tuft of dark hair had vanished. At last, she was startled by a splashing sound, and as she rotated her head, she saw a small stickleback fighting for his freedom. This distracted her. The astonishing reunion was pushed to the back of her mind, and carefully she made her way to where the line had been fastened around a large piece of jutting stone. The poor fish never stood a chance. What now? Should she reel it in? Call her father? Leave it to Spiller? The thought of him brought her only just now returned to normal heart rate back up to speed. Oh dear. A short while she tried to reel in the fishing line, but seeing the poor creature with his mouth agape and his distant glassy eyes, she quickly released the line and let the fish go. As far as it could go, that was, with the hook still caught in its cheek. Arrietty seriously pondered the idea of becoming a vegetarian for real. However, the sweet smell of smoked fillet, soft as butter, penetrated her memory, and with a small amount of guilt, she left for home. Now that Spiller was back, everything suddenly seemed radiant. The flowers permeated the morning air with their sweet fragrance. Simple rays of sunlight stirred wondrous flakes of dust that were dancing like fairies. The dark vines that, not 10 minutes ago, had seemed so gloomy, now invited adventurous quests, and Arrietty knew she could scale the walls to a new record today. Spreading her arms as wings, she imagined herself to be soaring, like the sparrow overhead that brought a nice, juicy meal to its nesting mate. So much in her fantasy world she was, that again she missed an important sound, the squeaking of the great side door. It was only her luck that had Mrs. Witless looking over her shoulder as she stepped outside, else Arrietty was seen for sure. As it was, a hand grabbed hers out of the bushes beside the path she was walking on, and with a small shriek, that Mrs. Witless discarded as coming from a mouse, she suddenly found herself huddled beneath a familiar figure. Now, to a human being, borrowers were as light as a doll. A big mouse, perhaps. An adult version may weigh as much as a kitten. To Arrietty, the weight of one not quite adult, but surely manly enough borrower felt very heavy. Even without looking, she knew who it was, and when she did look, 2 dark eyes were burning holes in hers. She almost forgot to breathe. Breathing is difficult anyway when someone is lying on top of you. Spiller realized this as well, and with a swift move rolled aside. Together they stared at Mrs. Witless, who, humming, walked down the path to do her morning chores in the church. Later she would water the flowers in the garden, weed a little among the seedlings, and probably wash the windows, since it was Monday. 2 pairs of eyes followed her billowing skirt until the closing of the gate announced to them she was really gone. Arrietty turned her head and found herself almost nose to nose with the very person who had changed her morning from doom to glory only minutes ago. They stared at each other. A soft breeze moved the tall grass that surrounded them. Distant murmurings of hidden creatures were heard on and over the earth, but close around them, the world had stopped spinning. Arrietty's whispered, "Thank you," didn't break the spell, even though it made Spiller's eyes flick to her lips for a fraction of a second. A strange tingly sensation overcame her at that moment. A giggle stirred, waiting to escape. She pressed her lips together to keep it in. The movement caused Spiller's eyes to flicker up and down again. And all of a sudden, he rolled away and disappeared again. Slowly, eyeing around, Arrietty got up and, a little more careful, continued on her way home. Immediately on her return to the house, her mother knew something had happened. For one, Arrietty's eyes were bright, and there was a spring in her step that had not been there this past week. The smile was a dead giveaway, and the humming. With wide eyes, Homily stared after her daughter as she passed through the kitchen, handing her mother a bouquet of freshly picked marigolds. A kiss on the cheek, and off she went. The humming echoed all the way up to the entrance of the living quarters. "What has gotten into that child?" she wondered aloud, adding a tiny slice of grated cheese to the stew in the stove. It was an old piece of dried meat from the larder, so the stew would have to simmer all day for the meat to become tender again. How she longed for one of Spiller's kills, even though the thought still gave her a chill. It just wasn't natural for borrowers to be so completely non-dependent on beans. No beans, no borrowers. That's what her mother used to say, and her mother before that. Arrietty saw those awful giants as possible friends, or at least some of them. Their run-in with the Platters had luckily cured her of ever trying to communicate with them again. Yet, wistfully, she stared around herself. If it hadn't been for Arrietty's Miss Menzies, she wouldn't be cooking in such fine pots and pans, as it were. With a shrug, she set the whole business of befriending human beings aside and finished the stew. Lid on top, and ready she was. Her hands full with a large bowl of breadcrumbs and cheese gratings, she followed her daughter up the stairs. A warm meal they ate from the kitchen table. Breakfast and lunch were better served in bright daylight. She found a cheerful Arrietty in the cozy living room with its grayish papered walls, setting the table and just finishing filling a neatly carved acorn that often served as a vase. "Oh, Mother, you forgot the flowers. Never mind, I will fetch them," the girl almost sang, and off she was again. What has gotten into that girl? Homily asked again. This time it was Pott who replied. Darned if I know. But it must be something good now, wouldn't you think? Here his hand came up to his chin, and with a thoughtful glance outside he murmured, I wonder. His sentence was never finished, for here came the girl herself. She shortened the stems of the marigolds and placed them neatly in the vase. Oh, Mother, do you remember the glass thimble we had back at Furbank? The way it caught the light in the afternoon? I wish we had one of those. A sigh, a dreamy, far-off look. Yes, Pod sure did wonder. His suspicion became confirmed as he, right after breakfast, opened up the grating and found Spiller sitting beneath the roots of a thistle. The lad quickly rose to his feet and gave a curt nod. Spiller, how good to see you. Pod smiled with ease, assured now of his daughter's happiness. No questions were put forth about absence or visited locations. No one ever asked Spiller where he went or came from. There was a silvery fish shape on the line that Spiller lifted up from the ground at his feet, and as Pod climbed upon the mossy brick beneath the grating, he saw it was a fish indeed. Marvelous, you caught one. Nice big one at that. You want Homily to broil it here for you? The answer came a bit delayed as Spiller's eyes drifted to a spot behind him. As Pod turned, he saw his wife, who gave a quick wave and busied herself with clearing the table, but also his daughter. Arrietty stood half in the shadow, and he doubted Spiller could see the redness of her cheeks. However, he was sure the boy could see her smile. A little astonished, Pod next watched a new sort of communication between the two young people. It went like this. Spiller, who was well known for his short sentences, held up the fish a little higher and coughed, after which he said, still eyeing Arrietty, You caught it. You choose. Pod, turning back from one to the other, took a few steps back as Arrietty came forward. He exchanged a look with Homily, who stood watching the whole thing with watery eyes. Arrietty answered, a still, sweet voice. I'd like it smoked. Can you show me how? She was a brave girl and felt her fingers tremble after this bold request. Quickly she hid them behind her back. Many times in the years to come, Homily would sigh and shake her head and proclaim dramatically, Oh, what it is to be young. One short nod. Spiller threw the line over his shoulder and began his walk up to his makeshift cooking place. Pod hardly had time to turn before Arrietty flew past him and hurried after Spiller. Together they stood, he and Homily, watching from their grand open doorway as the young couple walked side by side amidst the early wildflowers. Oh, Pod, his missus sighed, what it is to be young. He smiled, and in a rare show of public affection, placed an arm around her shoulders and kissed her on her crown. Yes, dear, I am glad all is well again. As the morning progressed and they each took up their daily tools, she her needles and he his hammer, they did so with a happy heart. Yet at the same time there was a strange feeling of loss they couldn't quite put into words. Homily would say, It is a good thing he came back for her, and he would nod. But underneath this affirmation was a concern. How would they live, he thought. Where would they live? And a little later he would say, Something good came out of us leaving Furbank after all. Homily nodded at this, but at the same time worried about the wildness of the boy and his need for independence. None of those worries, however, were shared or even remotely considered by the two borrowers in question. In silence, Arrietty followed in Spiller's footsteps, and in silence she watched a little later how he filleted the fish. His hands moved slowly, and every now and then he looked up to see if she understood the operation. She would nod, and he would continue. After that, he showed her how to light the oven, make the smoke out of dried herbs, and how to place the pieces of raw fish on the chicken wire. The hood of the oven was a large blackened chestnut top. It kept the smoke neatly inside. Leave it a day, he said at last, crouching low beside the handmade contraption. Arrietty nodded one last time and slowly rose to her feet. Now that there was no longer any action to distract her, she suddenly felt very shy. It made her wonder at herself. She had never been this insecure around Spiller before. What had changed? She lifted her chin a little to look at him and found him still crouched down, staring up at her. His gaze traveled down until his eyes rested on her boots. Good boots, he said and smiled. Arrietty felt the corners of her mouth curl up as well and stated, as if it wasn't obvious, "My father made them for me." After a thought, she added, "I wanted boots like yours." At his raised eyebrows and curious question, "Why?" she suddenly remembered a small talk she'd had with her mother. In a rather uncommon but genius stroke of foresight, Homily had sat her daughter down to speak of boys. It was not long after they'd met Peagreen. "Here's the thing with those young men," Homily had begun, her hands a steady going back and forth with the knitting needles. "Sometimes you have to give them a little nudge in the right direction." Arrietty, busy herself with some needlework, placed it on her knees and eyed her mother questioningly. "A nudge?" "Yes, you see, when I met your father, I saw immediately what a great borrower he would one day become. But although he had a great wit, I needed to give him a slight push to make him see things my way, you see?" Arrietty didn't. "Well," Homily began to feel a little heated, her hands moving faster. She was not used to talking of these private affairs. "It's the talking, you see. Men talk differently. They boast and chatter enough about work and borrowing and stuff, but when it comes to emotions, they just, well, they can't." So out of sorts Homily was by now that she made a mistake in her knitting and decided to rescue the piece by leaving it altogether. Her daughter had been watching quite intensively, and she knew she had to get it all out now, or she'd never find the nerve again. "You see, when I saw your father, I knew he lived under the clock, and in those days we would only meet everybody on high days such as Christmas. Of course, I didn't want to wait a whole year, so I mastered my nerves, stepped up to him, and said, Here Homily faltered. Arrietty attributed it to memory problems. After all, this had been a long time ago, seeing she herself was 17 by now. Yet it was not memory problems. Homily simply wondered at herself, how she ever managed to be so bold in the first place. Her daughter, with all her carefree walkabouts and plain thinkings, was more like herself than she had believed. Didn't she once say she would marry Spiller, just because the boy would be too shy to admit anything himself? Well then, Homily instantly felt more relieved. And more at ease, she finally continued. "I said, Pott, I like you. I think we'll make a good team. Please come and visit me." She heaved a deep, contented sigh. "You know, finding a partner for life is all about balancing strengths and weaknesses. You get to know theirs, and they get to know yours, and if it's a good match, well, there you have it." At the time, Arrietty hardly grasped the meaning of this bit of awkward wisdom. Yet now, seeing Spiller's intense gaze as he waited for her reply, she understood. She knew his strengths and weaknesses, and she found they matched hers splendidly, so now she had to tell him. She swallowed a lump, cleared her throat, and said, her voice only a little wavering, "Well, it's for when you'd want me to come with you one day." Spiller didn't immediately reply to this. His eyes widened a bit, and he stood up straight. By now he towered a full head over her, and she had to look up. After a silent few minutes, he simply nodded once and took her hand. Through a dark tunnel, probably dug by a rabbit once, carrying a stump of candle in his other hand, Spiller led the way, guiding Arrietty through a maze that ultimately brought them right up to the bank, where his boat lay waiting, carefully hidden behind an overflowing butterbur. As he helped her into the boat, Arrietty thought about her parents, about if this was how it had gone with them, if Pott had taken Homily by the hand and simply brought her with him to the house underneath the clock. Oh, she knew all about weddings and promises and witnesses and such, yet somehow she couldn't see Spiller in front of such a crowd and in some fancy suit. As Spiller used the large yellow knitting needle to push the boat a little away from the edge, she smiled. And later, as they sat next to each other beside a small fire in a cave-like hollow, somewhere along the riverbank, she laid her head contentedly on his shoulder. She would never be a house borrower like her mother. Spiller would teach her everything and take her places she'd never seen before. As for Spiller, though silently contented, inside his head there were many thoughts. Even though he didn't know as many big words as Arrietty did, he had a great deal of respect for her learned mind. He knew enough of the workings of borrower life. He observed and learned in his own quiet way. He had looked at Pott and Homily, at Hendreary and Lupy, and at all the other borrower families he knew that lived around the villages, and he understood. As he felt Arrietty's curls brush against his chin, a deep calm washed over him. He placed his cheek against her head, and together they looked out into the world they would discover. The end. Once again, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Good night.